and welcome back to the Masters of Modern. I'm your host, Alex Kessler, here with fellow patron and guest, Braden. Welcome.
Hello,
Welcome
my
back.
name's Braden. Yeah, back after a severe hiatus. Came on for the first time as a CEDH player. Now I'm coming back on as a Modern player. Pretty big transition.
It's the real evolution. You've become a Modern player. Ben has become a Commander player. The world streams have crossed. We're in the middle of Baldur's Gate, Commander preview season. There's conversations back and forth. We've talked all about Partner last week and the future of this Magic in general, with new Phyrexia possibly on the horizon. But we're going to talk Modern today because this is the Masters of Modern podcast. We're talking about Modern and Modern related things often. And as you said, you've been playing a lot of Modern over the last year and kind of want to, it's been about 2 to 3 weeks since New Capenna came out. There's a lot of new cards from that set, and we are going to go over what the metagame is looking at right now. What are the top decks? What are the decks you need to be worried about, as well as if there's any new cards that are kind of popping up on lists in the meantime. But Braden, really quick, where do you come from? Who are you on the internet? And what do you want to talk about today?
Sweet. So I am BradenMTG on Twitter. That is like where I do the most things, I suppose. I happen to work for Star City Games. I do pricing on Magic cards there, but most of the time I just complain about things on Twitter. I used to make CEDH content a few years ago, but I am retired from that. Now I just play Modern and go to as many Magic events as possible.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, we just released earlier, or I refound and posted on TikTok from that video. But you were the person who got Ben basically into Commander and me into CDH, along with Jim from the Spike Feeders. And there's a great video out there of us breaking down an intuition pile that has a great ending. It was bad for me. But
I'm so proud of the called shot too. That's the best part.
I RIP my life. But yeah, it was a really good intro to the format for him, and it got a Modern player who for 10 years I've been no, there's a way to play Commander that you will have fun in, and he was like, no, there's no way it can happen. I was like, okay, let's and CDH was the entree point into it, and part of that is that I think a lot of Modern players or a lot of Magic players that aren't Commander players are resistant to the fate isn't on my side and people will make decisions arbitrarily in Commander because it's casual. The stakes aren't correctly high enough, and you're dealing with 3 different people that have different incentives. And at least with CDH, you remove one of those 2 problems. You remove the every person is going to make the decisions to the base of their ability and even communicate with the pod to get information on what is the best chance of me winning versus, in Commander where someone will be like, oh, you wrecked me earlier, I'll wreck you in revenge. It's well, does that help you win? Or are you just doing that out of spite? And that doesn't exist as much in CDH or classically doesn't, unless you have a player that's salty. That happens in same things in 60 cards where someone will make a mistake due to emotional reasons, but that's competitive gaming.
I saw someone tweet today something to play CDH, 90% of what you need is the amount of sportsmanship required to play high school sports. And that feels about right. Just everyone needs to have a mutual respect for each other and understand everyone's kind of trying to play to win. Yeah. And once everyone's on the same page in that degree or angle, a lot of problems go away.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's one of the great, and then now Ben doesn't even necessarily like CDH. He plays regular Commander. More, I think from him, it was a perspective of I wanted to create things, and in CDH, he felt he was not enough of an expert to be able to craft decks specifically for that way of playing, which is fine. But that was his entree into it, and he was able to learn okay, this is how you play, this is how you do it, and has played probably more Commander than even Modern this last year. So partially because of the stream, but moving on to this, since then you've gotten really into Modern, and before we get into what the Modern metagame looks like, really quick shout out to sponsors. First off, thank you so much, Channel Fireball. If you're looking to buy cards, there's a link below. You can use our affiliate code on the link, or just use the MMcast at checkout, and it helps the podcast out a great deal. And if you want, you can see the video posted there every week. If you're an audio only listener, that's another place other than the YouTube channel you can find us. If you are also, big shout out to Ultra Pro, and we're going to let them get the Ultra Pro sponsored trivia. And Braden, I'm going to ask you a question, and this is how this is going to work. I'm going to ask you a question, and you're going to have to think about it. You're going to go back and forth, and then you're going to answer it. In the meantime, our listeners are also going to comment their answer. And if they get it right, I'll like it as either the podcast or my own personal YouTube channel. If they get it wrong, though, they have to like and subscribe to the podcast. That's the rules. I don't make them up. You've by listening to this, you've all entered into an obligatory contract. If you don't do the rules, then you'll be seeing a cease and desist letter. I don't even know.
The lawyers are coming.
Yep. We have so many Magic lawyers just rules lawyering it up. All right. In Magic, creatures generally have a power and a toughness. If you were to add all of the toughnesses in Magic and all of the powers in Magic together, which would be larger? Now, just X spells count as 0. There's an infinity elemental and an unset. None of that.
This is really stressful because I get this question almost always right whenever I watch the show. So this is real tough.
Yeah.
I have my answer. I'm locked in.
All right. You're locked in. All right, I want to hear your reasoning. Bonus points if you can give a percentage of what the difference you think is between the two. All right. Let's hear it.
All right. I think in general, there's like two frictions, like two things going back and forth here.
Mm-hmm.
Toughness is really bad for like limited. I feel like maybe I'm crazy here, but like if the whole format is like X, let's say they're like 2/3s, the whole format, things get really grindy and weird. But also in early Magic, there's like a million walls. So I think that's like some of the push and pull here. There's also like some weird stuff like, the 13 zeros or whatever. There's a lot of 2/1s out there, but there's also a lot of 1/3s. So I'm going to go with toughness. And okay. I think it's probably very close, like 10%. That'll be that's my guess.
So there's like walls are a big one, right? There's also a lot of 2/1s though. That was kind of the one for me, is like 2/1s and 3/1s.
I agree.
Like I think there are way more 2/1s than 1/2s. I think there are probably equal 1/3s versus 3/1s. And then like 2/4s versus 4/2s are probably pretty close. But then when you get bigger, you end up in like the 4/5 world, where I think there's I don't know, 4/5s versus 5/4. I think like,
there's a lot of 6/7s, like in limited, especially.
Yeah.
Like
there's also a lot of 6/4s. Like 6/4s are really popular, I feel like. Combo.
Like 4-mana 2/5s, you know what I mean? I remember there being a couple of these like in Khans of Tarkir, but I think that set environment specifically wanted them for Outlast or something.
Yeah. So I asked this question on Twitter a while ago, and the poll was power had 29% of the vote, toughness had 65%, and then results had 6%. But Magic Data Science at MTG_DS gave the information for the answer, and it is for every unique card there is 33,750 powers. Total power in Magic, and there is 36,258 toughness. So for the unique cards individually, there is more toughness. If you include every reprint, it's 84,861 versus 91,695, and so that ends up about a 7% more toughness in Magic.
Hey,
so you were really close. That was good. So if you commented toughness was bigger, good job. If you got 7%, double good job. If not, you gotta hit that like and subscribe button. And if you got it right, just please hit the like and subscribe button anyways. All right. So in Modern, let's just talk down top 10 decks in the last 14 days. Starting at the bottom. So number 10, Affinity is back. Now, I think this is just off of Affinity is always good. Now, obviously, there's a lot of Modern Horizons cards with the fact that you have Esper Sentinel, Urza,
Thought Monitor just hanging
out. But I think, like,
Shadow Spear and Portable Hole are both like really big game in these kinds of decks, right? Especially with Urza Saga. Like
Urza Saga does not find Portal Hole, though, right?
What I was thinking was Shadow Spear, like the fact that you can find Shadow Spear, give your tokens trample and lifelink, that's like pretty big.
Yeah.
And Portable Hole just being like a removal spell that like leaves an artifact in play is pretty massive.
What I think that's interesting about this deck is it feels totally different than previous Affinity. Like, I almost wouldn't call this Affinity. I would call it like blue-white Urza almost, just from a perspective that, like, other than Memnite, it's not playing Cranial Plating. Does it even have Memnites, or it doesn't even have like there's no modular cards.
There's 4 Memnites.
Not Memnite, sorry, Inkmoth. There's no Inkmoth, or there's no Moth lands.
To be fair, though, there are 4 Razortide Bridge, which is like absolutely a card you would only play if you really cared about Affinity, right?
Sure. Well, I mean, but like the irony is that this actually has an Affinity card in it that's really important to it, where the like modern Affinity deck never had it. So like maybe there is an argument that this is Affinity because you're playing with like Thoughtcast, Metallic Rebuke, and Thought Monitor, which is like way more Affinity than the Metalcraft version of the deck, I guess is what the old version was, which I think is really funny. And I didn't even like kind of notice that until just now, because it is. It's getting 8 artifact lands and really taking advantage of it. And you just never saw that before. But I think fair. This is Affinity, but the previous deck was robots. Like, Wizards really wanted it to be and never succeeded at branding correctly.
Yeah. I think one interesting thing in this list that we're seeing, it is, I just want to make sure, it's the Modern Challenge, second place, 7-1 on May 7th. There's no cards like Emery, and that's like such a powerful card at like grinding out. It's a very cheap threat with all of the artifact lands and everything. I just find that to be interesting that there isn't room for that kind of card in this deck, like the being able to recast your Thought Monitors, and
especially because you're playing with the Urza Socket package, being able to just like rebuy Aether Spell Bomb and like lock.
Yeah,
there are some decks just will get locked out if you have Aether Spell Bomb and Emery in play,
especially like the Ragavan decks.
Yeah,
like if you can bounce the Murktide like 2 or 3 times, it's like game over.
Yeah,
So just not.
And I think
they might come back from that, but
they're kind of playing Teferi in that spot. But I don't disagree with you. I think there's like definitely room for at least 1 Emery, if not 2. And just figuring out what card is cuttable for that. But yeah, number 9 is Amulet Titan. This is a deck that a lot of people, both before and after the banning, immediately after Modern Horizons 2, thought was going to be the big bad of the format. And then immediately after Lurrus was banned, everyone's like, no, Amulet Titan's going to be the big thing. And it's still just kind of hanging out in 9th place. This is the biggest change that really seems to have happened to this deck over the last while, is that just like Cultivator Colossus is in the deck. And that card is real good. But it hasn't got anything on New Capenna. It's gotten, obviously, it's gotten Besieger Who Endures, which is like the other big piece for the format. But continues just being doing what it's doing.
Yeah, Besieger is really powerful. It means it's actually led to a bit of a warping where Blood Moon instead is significantly lower power against this deck than Mages of the Moon, which means those 4 color decks that are on Eldari's Call are able to actually like main board Mages of the Moon and then just tutor it up in their 80 card deck in game 1 sometimes, which is just incredibly powerful. And then the Besieger just doesn't hit it. And if you look at their sideboard, a lot of the time, nothing in their sideboard hits it either. It's pretty interesting.
I think like the reason this isn't being 3.7% of the metagame is like on its own just like very good, so it might just have good matchups for some of the top 8. I think it not being higher is just like, this is a deck that if you can punish it, will be punished, and because it can stumble, and if it doesn't, it's going to get away with the game. But just being faster or more consistent helps. As you said, removal is weird now. Blood Moon is different.
Yeah.
And speaking of Magus of the Moon, the next deck, number 8. That's the sound effect. We have Crashing Footfalls. We have one of 2 Cascade decks in the top 10, right? Yep, I was right. I'm good at counting. And this deck is sick. I've always loved the Crashing Footfalls deck. I think like it's so interesting to me that the rules change around how Cascade works has made versions of cards that you play in this deck better. At the same time, like the fact that Dead and Gone and Fire Ice are good in this deck now. Now, Fire Ice was printed into the format in Modern Horizons too, so it's always been that way. But before Cascade, for those who don't know, Cascade used to cascade into the effect of whatever the smallest CMC of a card is, and then you get to choose which side you cast. So there was a boom bust deck in original Modern where you would cascade in it from Bloodbraid Elf, and sometimes you would hit boom, which is a 2-drop, but cast bust, which is a 6-drop, destroy all lands. And due to not those cards, but other cards being broken with Cascade, they eventually changed the rule. So now it's the total CMC of the full card, amongst some other rules changed in the same world. But it allows decks like this now that don't want to cascade into that spell, but want it because it's a good removal spell on turn 1 and turn 2 and turn 3, and get to play that and Dead and Gone, which Dead and Gone was one of our preview cards. So that's also sweet. Plus a bounce spell.
I also just think Dead and Gone is like secretly, I'm just going to get on my soapbox here for a sec. Dead and Gone is super powerful.
Yeah.
It's, if you look at the 2 best threats in the format right now, I'd argue they're Ragavan and Murktide, and that card answers both of them. You might say like, hey, bouncing a Murktide isn't an answer. It pretty much is if you do it enough times.
Right. Getting rid of their graveyard with it in their hand is the answer. So
yeah. So I think that card is sweet, and it is like one of the most fun cards to play in this Rhinos deck. This was actually the first deck I played in Modern. I started playing after NH2 came out, and I think this deck's really sweet.
I think part of what's cool about it too is like, because previously it was like we're playing with cycle cards to fill our graveyard with the Get Living on, and we'll talk about that deck in a second. With this one, it's more just like I just want my cards to be good cards that cost more than 3, but not always. And they've now, between Adventure and the Elementals and the rules changes around split cards, have kind of created a library of cards that all kind of function in this way that make the deck really interesting. And like, you just are Shardless Aging or Violent Outbursting into 8 power on turn 3 every turn, and in the meantime playing a decent control deck.
I will say one issue this deck does have is you're kind of living to your draws. So like you have a lot of choices in like what removal you use and when you play your threats. Like, do you play the Shardless first or the Violent Outburst first or things like that? There are a lot of choices in that way, but if you look at the deck list, there's almost never any actual card selection. So like there's no expressive iteration or opt or Jace the Mind Sculptor usually that allows you to like go through your deck and like find the cards you need to like win the game. And so a lot of the times it's about just keeping a good hand and playing it out correctly and interacting with your opponent in a way that allows you pressure to kill them in time. And that can be very like frustrating if you're moving from a deck like Murktide, where you just have like amazing threats, some of the best card selection, and some of the best interaction in the format.
Right. This you could just line up badly because you drew your Furies against the wrong deck, or you drew your Forces against a creature deck, and you're just like,
yep, exactly.
I have no option to get out of this. And you are like different than Living End. This is a deck that isn't putting the same type of, it's not like a combo deck, right? It's almost a tempo control deck that has, instead of a Murktide Regent, you're getting Crashing Footfalls, and that lines up against different people's removal differently, but it's not like, oh, I win this turn. It's one of the, when we did our set review for New Capenna, I talked about a card I actually really like for the Reanimator decks, which is the I forgot what it's called, but it's like the 8-drop charm creature, green creature.
Oh, Titan of Industry?
Yeah, Titan of Industry. I'm sorry. Okay. That's exactly the card I'm talking about. So Titan of Industry, because of the ability to reanimate that on turn 2 and have that much power, it plays a lot like Crashing Footfalls does, but instead of having 8 power, you have 11. And one of it is a reach trampling 7/7. And then also you have all the other options of like a defense token or getting, like, it stabilizes so well and blocks a lot of things that are in the way. But that would be, that kind of plays like what Crashing Footfalls is doing in a different way, but is a similar like, oh, I have to deal with a 5/5 and a 7/7 in play. I have to deal with 2 4/4s. What are the hoops I have to do to get that board state to happen? This is one card that you just have to draw versus that which is a Reanimator package. Next deck, So this is one thing that I think is really interesting because we haven't talked about this yet. But with the banning of Lurrus, there was a big conversation about what is the future of companions? Are they still problematic? Is Lurrus just like the first to fall off? And as soon as you get rid of him, does Grixis Death Show just to play Obosh? Or is Gigantha just going to be in every deck because it's not that hard to modify your deck to have a Gigantha there for free? Or the one that everyone kind of like knew was the next best one, is Yorion going to be just too good in the format and need to go next? Like, is the companion mechanic actually problematic, or is it just Lurrus was problematic, and now with the new fix, the other ones are fine, though interesting, but good. And so this is our first Yorion deck. Now, with that being said, in the top 10, 2, I believe, are currently there are 2 different companion decks, and both of them are Yorion. In the 7-day thing, though, you have Death Shadow that is playing Gigantha. That's the other one. And then is Azorius Control still playing?
No, I'm not sure. I think it depends. Sometimes they play Snapcaster Mage.
Yeah.
So local players play Snapcaster Mage, so I might be a little biased.
The one on here is playing that. But yeah. But let's talk the Blink deck. So I will say that in my head, whenever I see a Yorion deck, they all kind of look the same. Like, they have 4-color Blink here, and they have elementals, and the difference to me between these 2 decks is not a lot.
it's Risen Reef. It's that card. That is the really powerful engine that the elementals deck takes advantage of, and allows it to, instead
of playing like 1 Fury and 4 Solitude, it's playing 5, 4, 4, 4, and then like going all in on it, versus this one that definitely is much more of a control deck. Now, one thing that we have seen, but isn't on this list, is the new Counter Cat Yorion Vivian decks that are kind of the 4th version of this, because there's a 5-color Omnath too. So there's just like 8 different ways to play these decks. Now, those haven't had enough time really to kind of shuffle out. It's like, do they have legs versus these other options? But what are your thoughts on the Blink decks versus the Elemental decks versus the other ones?
So my actual thoughts are that the decks are very good. I do think they go to time really often in paper. I was at Pittsburgh, and there were a lot of games I noticed going to time with these Yorion decks, especially in the top 8. I think top 8 on Friday was like half Yorion decks, I think, or there were at least a couple. Otherwise, I think they're both pretty powerful decks. Obviously, one of them is playing like, Ragavans, Ren 6s, and Omnaths, and that's kind of like, it's just a good pile of soup, while the other is playing more like Risen Reef and your elementals, and has an incredibly powerful like grind plan, and you're able to cantrip off of your Risen Reefs, but also like your pitched elementals, so you can like solid suit your opponent's spell, and it stays like an equal trade when you do that. I honestly can't say, like, obviously I play a lot on paper at Star City Games, is like local store, and there are just not a lot of people who own these cards in paper. Like, I'm one of the few people who has the cards to play these decks, and I play other decks instead. But
there's a reason that they kind of have been classically called money pile, right? Where it's like, this is how much money do you have? Because then you build this deck.
I do know Corey Baumeister has been playing a lot of elementals on stream and in paper, and he's very hot on that version of it. And I do know there are like differences in that matchup. I imagine the elementals deck is way better at closing out games just because of the threat density and how it's able to just like constantly keep its engines running, constantly getting new cards in hand. The Oath of Nissas, the Risen Reefs are able to like really provide a lot of card selection. So if I was to play one today, I think I would play elementals, just because I think it's probably able to close out games easier.
Well, we'll talk about elementals a little bit more in a second, because the next deck is Hammer Time. This was the deck when Lurrus was banned. Like, this was the argument why Lurrus shouldn't have been banned, in my opinion, to be honest, was that like Lurrus was at the head of 6 different decks, and if you got rid of it, what does the metagame look like? Do these other decks lose their resilience? Hammer Time did not. And if you bring up the 7-day report, some of the other Lurrus decks that we're seeing play are still seeing play. So it ends up that it was for the most part, other than in maybe Zoomer Jund, not as key of a piece to the deck's functioning, and just was like a very samey version. Now, this has moved to blue, but that has more to do with the fact that they printed Reality Chip, and it's literally the only blue card it's playing, but is good enough to be able to take advantage of that card draw engine.
They play Teferi too a lot of the time, which is obviously very powerful with what the general game plan.
And then also if you go on the sideboard, there's a few blue cards that definitely show up from Lavinia to Spell Pierce and Meddling Mage. So you're right. But it's doing the same thing. It's getting a giant hammer onto a Memnite. And do you have a way to stop that? No.
That's what it feels like playing against the deck. Like you're just kind of like, do you have a way to not die to this? Do you have a way to piece apart the cards that are synergizing or stop me from being able to tutor up better threats? It's a very stressful deck to play against as like a control player personally.
To me, it's the most similar to what Infect was. Like if you were like a big fan of Infect back in the day, and you were you can play Infect. I think that there is actually a reason to play that deck, and that deck I don't think is gone. But if you're looking for a top tier, top 10 deck in the format that's been that way for 2 years now, this is the deck that's playing that same way. Where you're like, I'm playing small threats that I'm then going to make big, and if you tap out, or you don't tap out and try and remove stuff on my turn and on my terms, I'll be able to interact with it in a way that prevents you from winning. So you have to kind of tap out against me, and then if I get lucky and then can draw past you tapping out to try and kill my threats, I'm just going to let you stumble, then I've won. And how big can I make one thing do damage to you till you die, with a little bit of resilience and the fact that you can play stuff like the Reality Chip or like Sword and Fire and Ice to draw cards.
And Urza Saga just being a uninteractable, like, not interactable, but it's just a land that makes creatures. Like that's inherently a difficult thing for a lot of decks to interact with. Obviously, things like Wear and Tear improve that, like just because you can always just wear the land. But that card is very powerful and does a lot for the deck.
Where do you fall on the is Urza Saga good for Modern train?
I don't know. I think the fact that it's so easy to interact with so many different effects, like Wear and Tear and Force of Vigor especially. I'm not sure it's good for Modern, but I definitely wouldn't say it's a problem in Modern. Does that make sense? I think Ragavan is good for Modern, genuinely. Like I think having a threat like that kind of smooths out the format, requires people to be interactive in a way that's like healthy. Unlike Splinter Twin, where like having to be able to interact with your opponent like on your end step or on their turn every single turn for the entire game is like not healthy. But like having to kill a threat on turn one and maybe hold up interaction in case they have a dashed Ragavan later in the game, I think that's like really good for Modern. Urza Saga, it's like less clear to me.
I think what it does is interesting. I think as far as the Horizon cards go, the cards that I think I have the most problem with at this point is the Elementals. And even then, I like that they've brought a lot of good removal to the format. They've slowed the format down, right? There was a problem leading into 2021 of Modern becoming like even more siloed into ships passing in the night combo decks that are just or just big good stealth piles, and not having a way to slow either of those down. And the Elementals have created a really interesting game between value and removal and power level. Really, my biggest complaint, honestly, with Modern Horizons more than anything has just been the cost. Like the fact that this is injected about $1,000 into every deck in the format, or $500 into every deck in the format, is more of an issue now that we're getting back to Paper Magic than any of the gameplay experience. Because I think all these decks are really cool. I think the fact that Affinity, real Affinity, Amulet Titan, Hammer Time, playing like what old Affinity used to play. Because I guess that's the other thing, going back to Hammer Time, or we're on Hammer Time still. The one thing with Hammer Time is it is also, maybe Infect is a good example, but it also plays a lot like old Affinity did, right? Where it's like equipment based, getting an Ornithopter or a Memnite with my...
It loses to the powerful anti-Affinity hate that you're already kind of in pressure to play. I think that's a good thing. Keeps like the sideboards more reasonable. Like you don't want to have to play one Force of Vigor, one Blood Moon, one, you know what I mean? Like, because the format's so wide, it just is impossible to like actually sideboard. I think it's kind of cool that like, if you look at the top 10 we're talking about here, a lot of the decks are kind of similar in the way you attack them. Like Affinity and Hammer Time. We're going to talk about Living End soon. Living End and Rhinos, like Chalices, good against those. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think at the end of this, I want to because I don't want to do it now because it's spoilers. But if you were to take the top 15, which we'll read off at the end, and compare it to like decks of 2017 or 2016 or 2015, the format is not that different. The playstyles of what's good in Modern has not changed that drastically, with maybe the Elementals, Blink, Yorion piles being the one big new addition to what these decks are doing. Everything else had like-minded strategies going on.
I think, unfortunately, too, like the Yorion deck would probably look more like a typical Modern deck if it was a 60-card deck, because there would be pressure on like what slots to include. Yeah. There just wouldn't be enough room for everything the deck does. But because it's incentivized to play 80 cards so strongly by the existence of Yorion, it's able to kind of like include a lot of cards that like I don't think you'd really want to be devoting that much space to this type of card typically.
Well, like if Elementals wasn't playing Yorion, for instance, I think it looks a lot tighter and more of a actual tribal deck versus now where it's half a tribal deck and half a 5-color control deck.
Yeah, I agree. And I think like when you see people play like Ragavans and Elementals, which I've seen like some people experimenting with, that is kind of that's like a sign, I think, of the Yorion influence. Yeah. Just like having those slots to those kinds of cards that are not
which I do think is like I think it's an argument for why Yorion is maybe a problem, is you now have 3 different decks in the top 15, because the next deck is Elementals, which we've been talking about anyways. But so Elementals, and this kind of really brings it like home to me, where I do think Yorion is a problem for the reasons that you just said. Like all 3 of these decks could be really interesting different decks. Now I do think the difference between Elementals and Blinks has very similar incentives, right? You have Elementals wants you to play all of the Elementals, and Blink wants you to play Ephemerate with all the Elementals, and it's like Ephemerate versus Risen Reef, and which one of those is the better incentive?
Blink doesn't even usually play Ephemerate nowadays, in my experience. Maybe it does, I just don't see it. But even this list right here doesn't play it.
Yeah, you're right. It does not.
What Blink really is, in my opinion, is it's a 4-color control deck with massive value engines.
Yep.
And that's like, it's cool. I think it's probably a problem, but not to the degree I'm willing to complain about it on Twitter.
Like I think like Gigantha is fine, right? The fact that like some decks are going to play it is fine. I don't think you need to get rid of the companion mechanic anymore, but I do think Yorion and like it's exasperating this costing problem, right? Where it's like, oh, 3 of the decks are $2,000.
If you look at the rest of Modern, it's actually fairly affordable. Well, not affordable; it's $1,000, but it's not $2,000. But then you look at the Yorion decks, and it is literally $2,000. Like I just built Legacy. My Legacy deck was $2,000. Right. It was not a budget Legacy deck. I built 8 cast. My Modern is as much as my Legacy deck. So.
I think. Well, especially because like in Legacy, and this is how I got into Legacy. Like you can get away with just more fetches and less duels, and be fine.
There's also just very powerful monocolor decks that don't play duels or any reserveless cards. So that's all. That's the other thing. Death and Taxes is like $1,000.
Which I mean,
no reserveless cards.
On that note, one of the reasons I really like that Affinity is doing so well is it's a $500 deck. It's like an all-in, not super expensive option for the format, which is cool. But yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about Elementals. I think like to me, going through this, the fact that still Yorion is just the incentives of Yorion are bad for the format. What Yorion is doing is making the format feel samey. I don't know if I'm like at like this card needs to be banned yet, but like the fact that it's still like this doesn't really make me feel good vibes for Yorion, really. There's an argument though that once you ban Yorion, do you just ban Companion?
I hope they don't ban Companion, because my favorite deck in Modern is Lutri.
So sure.
Really hate if they did that. I don't want to die for Yorion sins. That's the one thing.
But yeah, I think Yorion and there are other mechanics historically that like double up on the ban list, right? There's all 5 Affinity artifact lands are banned for a reason. So I think you could argue that just like ban Yorion, ban Lurrus. I don't think any of the other ones are really necessary, Like
No.
Kihira is fine, Gigantha is fine, and Lutri is fine. I like one day. Well, Lutri is dope. Sorry, more than fine.
I'm like, yeah, it is.
The like one problem of like I can see Zerda like one day needing to be banned because they accidentally print the wrong card, but like at the moment we're
That's
not
like
there.
unavoidable, right?
Yeah,
That's
like
just
it's currently unplayable, and then one day they might print the wrong card that works with the other wrong cards, and now it's a problem. But I don't think we're anywhere close to that, and let that happen. So, and then we get to like Amari and Obosh and Karuga and the blue black one that I'm not remembering. Like none of those I am ever worried about.
I do think the companion should be detrimental, like in a measurable way.
Sure.
And I'm not sure Yorion is actually that detrimental,
right
at this point.
It is on the like on a Frank Karsten back of a napkin math efficiency perspective, but Modern is such a massive format that you get away
I'm not
with
sure
it now.
that's
It's no longer even
really. I'm not even sure that's really true when you have like demonic tutor instant speed for creatures. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like you just replace the 4 cards with that. You have Ren 6, like so it smooths out your mana. You have Omnath, which is a legendary creature. So like you want to draw it every game, but you maybe don't want to draw 3 copies of it. Like
right.
And if you don't draw it, you have 4 extra copies in the form of Eldami's Call. Like just seems like and then you have instant speed removal on a creature, so you can just Eldami's Call for Solitude, and then it just seems very like the 80 card thing is like, again, I think back of the napkin is really a good way of putting it. Like that's about as relevant as it feels when you're playing against it.
It's almost like a tried and true back in the day. This is in reality you shouldn't play more than 60 cards ever because it makes your deck worse. But like in modern times, I don't. If you have an incentive to not do that, any incentive, then you don't need to play 60 cards. Like
I think the only downside is that it pushes you to be creature based sideboarding just because of the way
the tutors sideboarding
is. Yeah, like your tutors are creature based, and you sideboarding is kind of like less influential. Like when you're changing 7 cards or 8 cards, which is like half your sideboard, it's not as influential as it might have been before. But again, when you have 4 tutors in your deck, I'm just not sure that really matters.
And the other side of that is this is a like good stuff value deck where like sideboarding in general was less important than necessarily like the linear style decks where it's like, oh, I lose if you have the hate card I need, or I can't beat you if I don't have the right removal spell. Elementals is like, well, I have endurance and I have solitude. What strategy are you doing that? And Fury, what of the 3 main strategies of a bunch of small things that I need to be able to kill, the one big thing I need to be able to kill, or your graveyard do I need to worry about?
Yeah, I think it's most of it, really.
Like it covers a lot. And like, sure, there might be something weird, but like, yeah, I think the incentives for Yorion are kind of, and that's kind of the same problem with Lurrus, right? Like, Lurrus's incentive, the things that you need to do to make Lurrus in your deck was nothing in Modern. Playing with only 2-drop permanents, not even spells, permanents is like what you were supposed to do.
Yeah.
And unless you're playing with specific cards like Yawgmoth, that is a combo piece. And with Yorion, it's like your deck, like I honestly think that if Yorion was a Kihira, if it was just like a 2/2 and had the same restriction, you probably still just play with 20 more cards in your deck.
It would be closer.
We're going to a classic. The other under, well, not under 500. The other $515 deck, which is Affinity's 510. So you want to be spendy. Burn. Burn has continued consistently to be on this list. It lost Lurrus and lost almost 0 steam from doing so, and is playing actually no cards different, which is kind of was the point with Lurrus and why it was a problem. This deck has almost not changed, other than I guess it's no longer green. We're no longer Naya. It's now just straight up red-white.
Sanctifier Envec is the only card I regularly see that's new.
In the main list here, it's a 1 of in the sideboard.
Yeah. And I will say, like, this deck is still really good. Like, I played against it 3 times this week. I played on Sunday and on Tuesday this week, and I did not win once. They just killed me. Like, they just had the Boros charms. My opponent one game went turn 1 guide, turn 2 guide, turn 3 guide Eidolon, and I just died. Like, couldn't beat that.
And like, they punish you if you stumble. They have, for Dragon Rage Channeler, Ragavan, anything with X3 toughness creatures that are a problem decks, they have an entire deck of removal spells to stop you from getting advantage on it. And if you're going to try playing something big, they're just like, cool, I'm going to go around you and then burn you for 8 or 9 damage.
Well, they'll just Searing Blaze it and be happy to convert that to a burn spell.
Right.
That's the crazy thing. So
yeah, I think it's really cool. First, I love that burn has just like continued to be like one of the important decks in the format. I think that's like the sign of a healthy format, is burn is a good deck in it. You don't want it to be the best deck in the format necessarily, but that has more to do with the reverse side of that power level spectrum, right? Like when Standard had a year where mono red, because of just the depowered down of Ixalan into Amonkhet, was the best deck. That was bad. But as long as it's a deck in the format and is viable, I think that's always very healthy.
It's pretty hard for that deck to be the best deck in the format when the card pool is as wide as modern is. It's
you can always just beat burn if you need to. It's just you're playing.
You can just play a couple Lightning Helixes and set up Lightning Bolts. And that problem just goes away.
Right. And then now we get to the next Cascade deck. And this is one I think you were really excited to talk about at the beginning before we started. And that is 4-color Living End. And, the first deck to see Grief, which I think is really funny how hyped people were for Grief and where it's fallen. But the biggest new card over the last few months for this deck has definitely been Colossal Sky Turtle, and along with Besiju, which is just...
Otawara is actually kind of a big deal.
I agree with that.
It's pretty useful in a lot of these later games where you've like drawn a lot of lands because you've been cycling, and they have like a Chalice or something, and you just like and turn Chalice it, bounce the Chalice, Violent Outburst or something.
One card that I've been like really impressed with like anything that can bring it back from the graveyard is Waker of Waves. I've gotten a chance to play this in a few different decks, and both in Modern with like Reanimate strategies or even in Commander, and I'm like, oh, this, if you have any graveyard synergy, this is a lot of cards, a lot of words that I like. Put it in my graveyard, it draws cards, it puts a threat in my graveyard, and if I get it back, it stabilizes my board if my opponents are trying to wide.
In Living End, especially, if you really think about it, a lot of times you're like doing a Wrath and bringing back whatever you got rid of earlier in the game, or that they just milled or something. And like, especially in the mirror match, whoever has the most Waker Waves, that's a big deal.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, Waker Waves is sick. It's also like, if you were talking earlier about the card advantage and card selection in Rhinos and how there just was flat out none, that is card selection. Like, I've seen some lists play 4. This list we're looking at has 3. That's 3 cards in your deck that in the late game allow you to just like pitch a bad card, put a land in the graveyard, put a Cycler in your hand, or put a Living End in the graveyard and a Cascade spell in your hand. So
it literally is like,
that's a big deal.
It's 2 mana, draw 3 a lot of the time, because you put it in the graveyard, you put another thing in your graveyard in a deck that wants to put things in your graveyard, and then you draw a card. So
it's actually also, if you think about it, the Cyclers are usually pay 1 mana, put 1 thing in your graveyard, put a card in your hand.
Yeah.
And so this card is basically on the same rate because you are still putting a threat often into your graveyard.
You're putting two you double cycle, and you get card selection out of it, and it's really cool. But I mean, this is kind of what I was talking about. Like, this is a deck that's been around forever. I think it's really cool. I think obviously Colossal Sky Turtle is also really cool in the fact that it gives you all of those different optionality. But
it lets you buy back a Cascade spell.
Yeah,
and it lets you bounce a Stacks piece, like a graveyard hate card. It's not a spell, which is like sometimes relevant under like a Chalice or not a Chalice, but some cards. Yeah,
no, I think Otawara is on the same deal, right? Like, between Otawara and the Turtle, you now have so much better resilience, and I think that's why this has become the better Cascade deck. Is before 6 months ago, graveyard hate was not your friend, and you didn't have a way to fight graveyard hate in a convenient way. So the Crashing Footfalls deck was just better because it didn't care about its graveyard. You could ignore it, and you just were a better value deck. Now you're doing a more powerful thing than what the Crashing Footfalls deck is doing off of its Cascade spells by a wide margin. And the one thing that you were bad at dealing with being graveyard hate, you no longer are worrying about. You worry about it because it's still there, but you have answers to it in your main deck that are easy to access and you can cycle towards.
Yeah, you also have you have 3 in reality, get rid of an enchantment card or get rid of an artifact card, and they're on lands, which is just kind of insane.
Yeah.
It's very, very powerful.
How do you hate this deck out now that it has 1 Besiju, 2 Otawara, 2 Colossal Sky Turtle at least, and 4 Force Negation, and then the rest, half of the other cards are cantrips that draw to those.
Yeah. My roommate, we were discussing what I should play at some event. I think it was a 1K locally. And I said, hey, I'm thinking about playing Living End. He's like, oh, you shouldn't play Living End. I'm like, why? He's like, you're just not good enough at playing Living End. I was like, what? And he was saying, when you play against good Living End players, it feels like no matter what you have, they always have an answer to it. They always know what hands to keep, how to sequence so that they can play around the graveyard hate. And when you play against a good Living End player, it really does feel like they have it all. They just always have it all. Because if they're picky enough with their hands, if they get a little lucky and they sequence correctly, they're basically unstoppable. It's very intimidating.
Yeah. And then go into the sideboard games, they can even, go farther than that. So it's cool how powerful this deck has become and where it's ended up on the spectrum. Number 2. And this was my pick for probably being the second best deck in the format, if maybe not the best deck in the format after the Lurrus ban, because it was one of the 2 decks that really had a big incentive to not be playing that card and was still doing really big numbers. And leading up to that moment was one of the main top 8ing decks. It was kind of the people would not think it was good or it wouldn't be on people's radars, but it's top 8 at every tournament that mattered in the last year. And it's why is no one? And that's Yawgmoth, number 2. And you always got to have your Birthing Pod combo deck, and it's now the Yawgmoth one. It was Heliod combo before that. It was Devoted Druid combo before that, and continues to do really powerful things. This is another deck that I think has benefited from the Lurrus ban in some ways, in the sense that just it's able to be a better value deck than the other ones out there, and then operates under the modern consideration of, I'm going to be a beatdown value deck, and you have to answer that. But while you have to answer that, you also have to be aware that at any moment I just win the game.
Yeah, I'm not great at Magic. I really shouldn't be talking about Modern, but I am so bad at playing against this deck. I never know which part of the deck to respect at any given moment. I played against it so much in Pittsburgh, and as the weekend went on, I felt myself get much better at handling that as I played against it over and over and over again, because it was very popular that weekend. But this is a really sweet deck. At least for me, I have such a hard time with it. It's just so powerful. It just dodges and weaves,
It's threat or removal resistant. Yawgmoth is better than even what the old Kitchen Fink Malero combo used to do, because even if you have already undied your creature, you can, as long as you have another creature that you don't care about, you can bring them back down to a power and toughness that's manageable to start going infinite with them. The threats get bigger. You have multiple tutors, and you're really tutoring for two things, right? That was one of the issues too with Birthing Pod, or one of the reasons Birthing Pod would be better than Eldritch Evolution or previous creature combo decks Eldritch Evolution wasn't a perfect card for, was because it was either decks that didn't want their creatures to die, and so sacrificing something to go tutor for your combo piece wasn't going to work, or you needed multiple combo pieces to get to the state you needed to win. In this, you just need 2 combo pieces, and one of them sacrifices to find the other. So I definitely see why it's hard to prioritize. What are you supposed to do against this deck when at any moment they're either going to ignore the fact that you're trying to kill them, stop them from killing you with their creatures, and just win with a combo, or they're going to punish you while you wait for their combo piece to come out and then just beat you down.
There's some really scary sequences where you let's say they go turn 1 threat, turn 2 threat, they're on the play, and you're sitting there you kill the first threat, Second threat, you're like, do I kill this or play this Rest in Peace? And you're like, I'm going to play the Rest in Peace so I can kill the threat later on a rate that's decent. And then they just slam a Grist down, and you're looking at like the Force Negation in your hand, and you're like, this does nothing. Like,
Right,
you know,
right.
like I thought I could kind of extend a little bit here to like start getting an actual game plan out, but then you just die to the Grist. Like, so there's a lot of angles where like there are key turns against this deck that like where maybe the turn they play Yawgmoth or the turn they play Grist, it's really like the third and fourth turn for this deck, I find, where you just like die and then you find out like 5 turns later that you died to that like threat they played on that turn.
Right.
And
right.
it's very hard to deal with. Like, you know, if they play Wall Roots, they power out a bunch of stuff, and then later they play Yawgmoth, it resolves, and they eat up all that stuff. Even if they don't like end up with threats in hand, they just now have 7 cards to your like what is probably 4 or 5 cards, and like that's just a very hard thing to come back from.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really sweet deck. I've also heard it's just pretty challenging to play correctly. We have a local who plays it, and he seems to do pretty well for himself. He top 8s a lot of the 1Ks we have.
That was what was true of Birthing Pod. And it's honestly one of the things I kind of knew going into that last season where before Loris was like, one of the reasons this deck isn't doing better is because it's hard. It's like these types of decks where you have this many optionality and knowing what strategy you need to be leaning on against each opponent aren't easy, and being able to know what cards are the best cards to be playing in these decks, knowing, oh, like I should be playing 4 Grists, or I only need 1 Geralf's Messenger versus 4, or I need 1 Endurance versus 3, or, you know, it is building a little bit of a puzzle that takes time. And then that brings us to our number 1 spot. I think no one's surprised that this is the number 1 deck in the format right now. It, you know, is playing 3 Dragon Rage Channeler, 4 Ragavans, 4 Murktide Regent, is the first deck that we've really talked about that has had a significant increase in power level due to New Capenna in the form of Ledger Shredder, which we're going to talk about, and that is number 1, Murktide Regent, blue-red, tempo, X, whatever. You were playing Splinter Twins. This is what you're doing now. Deck.
Yeah, that's true. I got a lot of local friends who play Murktide who were big Splinter Twin fans.
Yep.
So you're absolutely correct.
I think this is like going out of the ban. It's like, okay, this is probably the best deck in the format. It didn't lose anything from the earlier span and was put in a position where it was already the 3rd best deck in the format. And the only reason it wasn't number 1 is because Grixis Death Shadow was just the version of this deck that played Luris. Murktide has proven once again that Delve is a very powerful mechanic.
Who knew?
I still am surprised. Should never doubt it. And then we've talked about Ragavan already, but Ragavan continues to be very powerful, and one of the best creatures ever printed. I think a lot of people underlooked the fact that Expressive Iteration was just going to be this important to Magic when that was printed. It definitely, I think, was like, oh, this is just like a random telling time variant. And now it's like, oh no, this is the card that is giving so many blue-red decks in every format the card draw engines they need to survive. And just, you know, Mishra's Baubles there.
I mean, let's look at, like, we were talking about Rhinos, right? I think these are like I think these are reasonable decks to compare. They're both blue-red at their core, and they're both trying to like tempo people out while like playing these cards that create some type of advantage. So like the Cascade spells make 2 bodies. That's relevant. If your opponent has to kill both of them individually, like you're coming out really positive on that exchange, which is often what happens. But the thing we talked about with Rhinos was like there's no card selection, and I brought that up with Living In too. But if you look at this deck, your Mishra's Baubles offer card selection in the form of like using fetch lands to manipulate the top of your deck, or your Ledger Shredders. You have your Ledger Shredders. You have your Dragon Rage Channelers. Your Ragavans also provide card advantage in the form of like just stealing your opponent's cards. Your Considers, your Expressive Iterations, and your Archmage's Charms are all just constantly letting you churn through your deck as quickly as possible. So this deck's playing the best threats, and those threats, not so coincidentally, happen to be like the best card selection spells, like in the format. So it's, to me, that's like the actual. This isn't like a secret, but that is the juice here, right? That's like the actual nutty thing that's happening here is like insanely well placed out threats that are insane on their rate, backed up with card advantage and also these threats just happen to produce card advantage on their own too.
There are 24 card advantage cards in this deck, and of them, half are actually just threats that are in card advantage trench coats. Right, like Dragon Rage Channeler, Ragavan, Archmage Charm isn't a threat, but it's a removal spell, and Ledger Shredder is a threat. Like all of those are just like, I'm accidentally advantage. And then you have some of the best cantrip cards in the format on top of that. So it is able to just like always draw to the threats it needs, power out its graveyard to get Murktide Regents and Ledger Shredders out big in a way that's important. And all of its threats in different ways are hard to deal with. Dragon Rage Channeler, Murktide Regent, and Ledger Shredder are all in the air and big eventually in some fashion. And then Ragavan is on the ground early, but then late game, if you get into a top deck war, can be, dashed out into play very quickly. And it's a legendary, so sometimes you're like, I'm fine if the first one died. Here's the second one.
Yeah. Also, Ledger Shredder is just like willing to throw that extra one away.
Yeah.
Insane garbage. So,
did you when you read Ledger Shredder think that it was going to be this powerful in Modern or in other formats?
So it's tough because like as part of my job, I actually have to like churn through spoilers very quickly, and like. But I will say Ledger Shredder was one of the first cards spoiled, and when I read it, I was like, "Ooh, this looks like a CDH card to me." Which, if you think about it, that's like a vintage power level format.
Yeah.
So I think that does display like a recognition of this is a powerful card, but I didn't have enough time to really like sit down and think about it in Modern. But the moment I saw someone say like, "Hey, what do you think of Ledger Shredder in Modern?" I was like, "Oh, wait, this is." Like once my focus got turned to it a second time, I kind of thought about Mishra's Bauble, and I've been playing a lot of Lutri, and Lutri is very heavily a counterspell deck, and so I get in a lot of counterspell fights with other decks, and just having like that body as a threat plus the card selection became immediately impressive to me because that's the kind of card that deck wants. So,
right. And in many ways, it's a turn 2/2/3 flyer that that drew you a card and will next turn be a 3/4, and the next turn be a 4/5.
I was playing this burn recently, and I had some really interesting sequences where I was like playing cards to just dig deeper with the Ledger Shredder, and like they were kind of incentivized to not double spell on my turn, on their own turn or my turn, because they didn't want to dig me into counter spells to like turn off their stuff. And so like when your opponents are like having to like tempo themselves kind of to like prevent you from like digging for answers, that's like a very powerful effect,
right?
You know.
Right. It definitely was. It had a little bit of the what's the card? Boros Reckoner did this, as did Walking Ballista, where it was like card dropped on last day of previews during big dump, and everyone was like, "Oh, that's just like a random rare. Who cares?" 3 days later, oh wait, all of the stats on this are above rate in a way that we didn't really think about.
Yeah, I think one thing that happened is the Esper commander kind of stole the show because it also connives at like an absolutely insane rate.
Yep.
So I think like the Twitter discourse probably got a little distracted by that card, even if it wasn't like the modern Twitter discourse.
Well, and Connive plays a lot like Explore, but in a way that's better, but is hard to maybe evaluate because you're like, oh, Explore was fine. It was powerful, but it wasn't format defining outside of standard.
Yeah.
And this lets you actually cycle through cards in a way that is better.
I mean, this list we're looking at right now, just to be clear, is like the first place 6-1 Modern Challenge from May 14th. 3 Dragon Rage Channeler, 2 Ledger Shredder. That's insane. Because, I mean, there have been actual debates on whether or not DRC is better or worse than Ragavan. And I've even seen people cut Ragavans for the Ledger Shredders, go 4 DRCs, 4 Ledger Shredder, like 1 or 2 Ragavan or no Ragavan.
Right.
So that's like an insane power level for a card to be at, especially in Standard. So,
and there's this list went down on Lightning Bolt and Archmage Charm for 2 Ledger Shredders instead of cutting down the creatures. Like there's different options for. I think we're in that moment where people are figuring it out. I would not be surprised if Ledger Shredder might just be a 4 of.
I think so. The thing I heard Spiring Spike talking about this, and one thing he mentioned is some cards get worse once they're like live and like doing the thing they're supposed to be doing. So like you really only want 1 Ragavan if you're hitting someone with Ragavan every turn. just as an example.
Yeah.
With Ledger Shredder, the second copy is like insane, but also just like the second copy can just get pitched to the first copy if you really don't want to have 2 Ledger Shredders.
Right.
But also, if you have 2 Ledger Shredders, you're drawing 2, discarding 2 every time someone casts their second spell. So you're like looking through a massive portion of your library. Like, that's an incredibly powerful like thing to have going on in a game of Magic.
And we were talking about like how many of the other decks are also picking up like how good bounce spells are against something like a Murktide Regent, but Ledger Shredder changes the math on that because now my graveyard is just going to get big again, and unless you're like rest and piecing me alongside this experience, I'm just not going to care that much.
Also, Ledger Shredder as a threat that can get bounced to hand is not that great. So you bounce a like, I don't know, if you bounce a Murktide, right? They need to like delve quite a bit for the Murktide to be like good again. Also, they might just play as like a 4/4 or something, but that's not really what they want to be doing. With Ledger Shredder, sure, you made it a 1/3 again. Maybe now it ties to Bolt or something, but it goes back to hand. So if you have another copy, you can just discard it if you want. But also, like, it's happy. They're just happy to pay 2 mana and play it again. Where with Murktide, they can't always do that. If you bounce the Murktide and they delve their whole graveyard, it's just now a 7-mana spell in their hand.
Right.
If you bounce the Ledger Shredder, just a 2 mana 1/3, which then they can just replay, play another spell, connive. Now it's back to being a 2/4. What did you really accomplish here?
Right.
I mean, you prevented a significant amount of damage probably, but you didn't like gum up their hand the way Murktide would have.
And there's even like a thing that we like haven't discussed with like Ledger Shredder, which is like a 1/3 flyer is not bad as a 2-drop in this format. Being able to just like brick wall a Ragavan and just be like, sorry, the card doesn't do anything anymore, and I'm going to be drawing cards because of it, is like a worthwhile endeavor. And then just add any other stats to that, you start really looking at a card that's worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's not perfect. Like if you're on the draw, it's pretty medium.
Yeah. A turn 3 Ledger Shredder is not exactly the best answer to Ragavan, but then you deal with all the other benefits that we've talked about, where it's like, okay, this is still good, but sometimes it's a turn. I'm on the play, and what are you going to do against this?
I think like a lot of I don't know about you, but like if you play Murktide, sometimes you have these hands where you go like turn 1 threat, turn 2 threat, turn 3 hold up like Archmage's Charm or a counterspell, and then like turn 4 you're like really hoping to go Expressive Iteration into like land plus Murktide, you know, or land, you know, you really want to like be able to hold up 2 mana or go like Expressive Iteration into a hold up a counterspell, and this card plays pretty well into that sequencing.
Right. It is great in the strategy that you're already doing while also offering new angles of building the strategy in a way that you want.
And a lot of time you will cast Expressive Iteration on turn 2 and like hold up 1 mana or something. It's not like that's like always what you're doing, but it being 2 mana always is actually pretty sweet.
Yeah,
obviously you prefer it to be 1 mana, but
yeah, I agree. Everything. So that's the top 10. That's currently the top 10 card decks that are seeing modern play right now post New Capenna. There's all other decks that we've seen kind of start popping up. We have, as I mentioned, the Vivian decks, the kind of the new birthing pod. But I did want to, I mentioned at the beginning, like the rest of the top 15 are Jeskai Control, Mono Green Tron, 5-color Omnath, Azorius Control, and Jund. And with that collectively, if you've been playing Modern from the beginning, or if you left Modern 6 years ago and came back just now, and you're like, oh wait, Jund is still one of the best decks. Oh, there's like a creature combo Yawgmoth birthing pod deck. Oh, there's 2 different Affinity style decks. There's both a Scapeshift like Amulet Titan deck or a Mono Green Tron. There's multiple Jeskai over blue-white control. Like the format, Burn is in the top 5. The format hasn't changed that much. It's just the pieces that are making that format that seems to have evolved.
Yeah, I think it's a bit overstated sometimes how like Modern has changed since Modern Horizons 2. A lot of the pieces have changed, like the counter spells might have changed. No mana leaks or romance anymore. Now you're just playing counterspell or Archmage's Charm, but they're kind of doing the same thing. Like I keep bringing up Lutri because I play Lutri, but like I play Lutri, right? And so I play a lot of the cards that don't see play anymore, like Mana Leak and Path to Exile. And those cards are actually like a lot of the time pretty similar. Obviously, like you have to play a little quirkily when you play with them because you need to like make sure your opponent doesn't have 3 mana up or something. But a lot of these cards are very similar. Like on turn 2, Counterspell, Mana Leak are the same card effectively. Right. And so like that's going to the fact that like Magic is a game and like these cards are all kind of just doing the same effect means that like these decks are just going to over time be pretty similar to each other because like you're just making slight optimizations at a certain point. And then they put Besage and Prismatic Ending, and then you can throw that out the window. But
yeah, it's but even like even the Living End decks, right? Like Living End existed back in the day. I agree with you. I think like part of it is the issue with the Modern Horizon decks is not like they invented new strategies. It's almost the problem is that they didn't invent new strategies, and when they kind of did, they were so powerful that they had to ban them. It's more that they just added $500 to the deck you were playing. Now that's $500 over a 3-year period, which is maybe fine depending on how you look at it, but it is a little bit, I think, of where people are like, that's the issue with the change that has happened, which sucks. I sympathize, right? Like there's a version of this where a lot of these decks, if they hadn't had printed the elementals, you would be able to still play your Jund deck from back in the day, but now you're dealing with different options and what you need to play. Now, the fact that Tarmogoyf is still a 4 of, I love. You're never going to hear me complaining about that. But Tarmogoyf, Seasoned Pyromancer, and Ren and 6 adding a nice $500 to the deck list you're playing is I can imagine something that it's like a little rough. Now, speaking of Rivet Deer's Charm is seeing play there, so shot call.
I want to bring this up actually. My friend Jay is the person who had the 4th place or 5th place finish at Pittsburgh, one of the 5Ks with Rivet Deer's Charm. They are a very big fan of that card. It is very powerful.
Well, like I think when everyone was reading it, that was the one I was like, oh, that's the one. Because the first 2 abilities are things that you would spend that amount of money, that amount of mana on to do in Modern, theoretically, regardless. Now, you wouldn't love it. It wouldn't be the best card, but the fact that you get both options, and then you get Exile a Graveyard, which is just like one of the best incidental words you can add to a card in Modern, makes the card just like really powerful. Yeah, I really like it as well.
Yeah, I also think Jund being able to have this card that acts a lot like Expressive Iteration is pretty important. That's a problem I feel like the deck has had, is that sometimes, like, Lurrus obviously fixed this problem by just being absolutely broken. But the deck sometimes runs into points where it's just like you're in top deck mode, and Ren 6 helps with that with like Takanuma or Soken Zen if they're on that too. But it does feel like the deck needed something that just kind of let you go up cards instead of just trading 1 for 1 forever.
Right.
And this card allows you to trade 1 for 1 with like a Murktide, for example, which is huge. That's a big deal. But also lets you just like, hey, end step, I'm going to try to draw 3, and if you want to counter that, go ahead, because now I'm just going to resolve the 3-mana Planeswalker in my hand.
Right. And I do think that they're like, you have a lot of cards in here now that are acting like Expressive Iteration, either in lowering what your opponent is doing, like Kroxa, or Seasoned Pyromancer and Riveter's Charm, right? And that's what Jund's supposed to do. Jund is supposed to have a bunch of cards that all say draw 2 cards, or draw a card your opponent kills a creature, or my threat, like it's all incidental value that lets your Tarmogoyf be a 7/9 that punches your opponent in the 7/8 that punches your opponent in the face in the meantime. So I'm not surprised Jund will survive the apocalypse. It's the cockroach of Magic.
And if it doesn't survive, Jund players will continue playing it regardless. Yeah.
Well, it's one of those things where like almost every single time you talk about Modern with people, they're like, Jund's bad. And I'm like, except it's in every top 8 ever. And the answer is that like Jund players aren't going to play anything else anyways, and they're good at it. And it is proof in the pudding of Modern too, where it's like, if you are good at a deck, you are likely to do better than if you are playing the best deck but not know what you're doing. And with the case of Jund is that exact pile of cards that like they have it's always 50% of the field. It like just has good removal. It's playing good threats. It's able to answer pretty much anything. Nothing that it runs into is going to be an actual bad matchup unless you're Tron, and which you don't see in top tables anyways. And so you're going to be able, if you're better than your opponent, capitalize on that.
I think my friend Jay says something along the lines of like, if you think you have a good matchup against like Jund, you're probably wrong. Right. It's probably just okay. It's like, and Jund doesn't really have bad matchups. They're just okay. That's the trade-off you're taking. You have no free games, and you just have to be better than them every time.
Yeah. And there are players that just aren't that, or at least have played the deck enough, like, because Jund has existed forever. If you've been playing Jund since 2014 or earlier, if you were playing in Standard, you like just know what you're doing. And your opponent, most decks your opponent is playing don't have that longevity of skill that could be added. And even with Brennan 6 and even with all the additions, none of those cards are that different than what they were doing before. You're just playing with a slightly upgraded or slightly different angle of attack than you had before, and get to do more creative things. All right, so that is anything else you want to talk about Modern before? I think that is it for today's episode, unless you have anything else you want to call out.
No, that's it. I will say play Lutri. It's so much fun. I love that deck.
I literally have the entire list printed out for a proxy to play at some point. Ready to go. Yeah,
that's awesome. Is it my list or is it someone else's?
It was from before. It was like right after the Luris ban, so I don't even know where I got it. But it's there's Lutri right there.
I'll send you a list. I've made some changes with New Capenna and with Kamigawa.
Oh yeah, I'd love to look at it. That sounds super dope.
Yeah, it's Jessica instead of 4 color. Although your list might be 3, might be Jessica too.
Oh no, it's Jessica. It's Jessica because it's playing or it might be 4 color. It has Neil Spellbomb, which makes me feel like it's 4 color.
Yeah, I like the 3 color version.
Once a printed out proxy list is rolled up like this, I don't think it actually works in sleeves anymore. So I'll be figuring that one out later. But if you want to try out lists like that, we can post. Braden, if you want to send me the Lucci list, I'll put it in the description of this episode so people can get access to it, because it definitely is. It will be pretty dope if you want to try it. And if you like it, go to Channel Fireball and buy those cards using the MMcast code that we have. Thank you, Channel Fireball. Also, Alter Sleeves. If you go to altersleeves.com and want to check out cool stuff there, also use the code the MMcast and get cool stuff and help us out there as well. Braden, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me on Twitter at BradenMTG, and you can probably find me at SCG events. I work for them, and if I'm not working the event, I'm usually there playing Magic against people and having a good time. I just built Legacy, so if you play in any Legacy side events at SCG events, you might see me there.
And last thing is, if you want to check it out, I make TikTok content all the time. And if you're excited by Baldur's Gate, I am going to be breaking down a bunch of different commanders. I've already talked about 3 of them, including a bear that for 2 mana, you get a flying trample, death strike ward 3, pay 3 life. Just and then you have to sacrifice a creature every turn, but ignore that. Just giant bear, flying bear. And we'll talk about Baldur's Gate probably next week as well. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, our sponsors. Thank you, patrons, for making sure this podcast happen. And if you want to check the Patreon out, there is a whole beginning episode where we reviewed Multiverse of Madness, which we'll probably do again next week because Ben didn't get to speak about it yet, and he's just going to want to complain because he hates it for some ungodly reason. Thank you so much, Braden, for joining. Thank you, everyone, and make sure that like and subscribe button. We'll talk to you next week.
This has been a production of Time Traveler Media, sending podcasts into the future.